Hello, I'm Dr. Ralph Hughes. In this video lecture, I discuss different types of power and how leaders are ultimately tasked with empowering employees. Today's learning objective is to critically evaluate power, politics, conflict, and negotiation. The concept of power is related to leadership because it is part of the influence process. So the question is, what is power? Power is the ability or capacity to perform or act effectively. It is the potential of a leader to influence others. People have power when they have the ability to affect others' beliefs, attitudes, and courses of action. In organizations, there are two major kinds of power: position power and personal power. Position power is a power a person derives from a particular office or rank in a formal organizational system. It is the influence capacity a leader derives from having higher status than the followers, essentially. Vice presidents and department heads have more power than staff personnel because of the position they have in the organization. Position power includes legitimate, reward, and coercive power. I will talk a little bit about each and every one of these types of power and define them, and also talk about the ideology when it comes to coercive power later in this lecture. Personal power, on the other hand, is the influence capacity a leader derives from being seen by followers as likable and knowledgeable. When leaders act in ways that are important to followers, it gives leaders power. For example, some managers have power because their subordinates find them to be good role models. Others have power because their subordinates view them as highly competent or considerate. In both cases, these managers' power is ascribed to them based on how they are seen in their relationships with others. Personal power includes reverent and expert power. In the discussion of leadership, it is not unusual for leaders to be described as wielders of power. Essentially, this is not leadership. When a leader wields his or her power, that suggests that the leader does not have a good understanding of himself, his followers, and how to effectively use power. In these instances, power is conceptualized as a tool that leaders use to achieve their own ends. Burns emphasized power from a relationship standpoint. Power is not an entity that leaders use over others to achieve their own ends. Instead, it occurs in relationships and should be used by leaders and followers to promote the collective goal of the organization. So again, how should leaders use power? Leaders use power when they determine whether they will gain commitment or compliance from others. Depending on how the leader uses power will determine whether they will gain commitment or compliance from their followers. So now let's explore the different types of power. Reverent power. Leaders demonstrate reverent power when they behave ethically, morally, and judiciously and respectfully toward others. Expert power. Leaders have expert power when others respect and value their expertise. Reward power is a transactional behavior that generally engenders compliance from followers, such as raises, promotion, etc. And legitimate power is the power that automatically comes with the title of manager or leader. Leaders use coercion tactics to force people or employees into doing what they want them to do. Some examples of this are threatening employees' jobs, taking away promotions. So instead, leaders are expected to empower their employees. How do leaders empower their employees? There are some action steps that leaders can take to empower their employees, such as utilizing the characteristics, traits, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that they bring to the table, lowering themselves to the officers or to the subordinates' position as employee, not wielding their power over the employee, not suggesting that they are better than the employee, coaching and mentoring the employee. This is how you empower your employees. So to invest with power, equip or supply with an ability, and you enable. This is empowerment at its finest. When you invest in employees, when you equip them, supply them with the competencies, the knowledge, the abilities to perform the task, where employees feel that they are part of an organization that is greater than themselves and they bring their true selves to the table, immerse themselves in the process in order to ensure the collective goals of the organization are met. You enable employees to be part of this exchange relationship. By doing that, you empower the employees. So the concept of power is essentially the potential to influence. Again, there are two kinds of power, position and personal. Position power, which is much like assigned leadership, is a power an individual derives from having an office in formal organizational systems. It includes legitimate, reward, and coercive power. Personal power comes from followers and includes reverent and expert power. It has given the leaders the opportunity to believe that, and the understanding and the know-how that their followers can do the job. They have the competency to do the job. And the leaders trust that the employees can perform the job. They also believe that the followers have something of value. So treating power as a shared resource is important because it de-emphasizes the idea that leaders wield their power and that leaders use quote-unquote coercive power. There is no such thing as coercive power, simply because power is supposed to be used as something good, a positive, in the realm of leadership. If everything we know about leadership is inherently good, there is nothing that the leader can do that will be construed as bad. There's no such thing as good and bad leadership. There's only leadership. If you categorize someone as being a bad leader, suffice to say that individual is not a leader. So why do we talk about leadership when we discuss organizational behavior? Leadership is very important, is an important function of organizational behavior. It is that very component that exists for the fulfillment of the organizational mission, and is that leader's responsibility to elicit buy-in from all members of the organization, to be aligned with the organizational vision, the organizational values, the organizational purpose for being, and how the leader is going to share that vision with everyone in the organization for the fulfillment or attainment of the organizational goals. That is why when you talk about organizational behavior, you cannot talk about the behavior that exists without talking about the individuals that make up the organization. It is the individuals that actually create the behavior within the organization, whether the behavior is positive or negative. So understanding leadership, understanding management, understanding emotional intelligence, understanding culture and the dimensions of culture, understanding ethics, understanding respect, all relates to power and how leaders choose to use power to empower employees. So the very essence of leadership in the context of organizational behavior is simple. Effective leaders forge alliances. Effective leaders create atmospheres conducive for innovation, motivation, and inspiration. Again, leaders align everyone in the organization to forge ahead to attain a common goal or vision. Leaders do this through the appropriate use of power, which inevitably makes that leader powerful. And once that leader becomes powerful, by sharing and eliciting buy-in from all organizational members, the leader then is in a unique position to again empower everyone in that organization, so then everyone in that organization can be a leader. And when you have a culture of leadership, you have a culture of powerful individuals who are empowered to ensure that the organizational mission is accomplished. Hello, my name is Dr. Ralph Hughes. In this video lecture, I discuss titles as it relates to organizational structure and followership. First, let's look at organizational structure. Organizational structure, one of the things we have to be concerned about is the span of control. The span of control is essentially the number of employees that a leader or manager can direct efficiently and effectively. We must also look at the chain of command. The chain of command simply is the unbroken line of authority that extends from the top of the organization to the lowest echelon and clarifies who reports to whom. Now we have to look at authority. Authority is the rights, the inherent rights in a managerial position to give orders and to expect orders to be followed by organizational members. There are various organizational structures that exist, such as simple structure, the bureaucracy, and the matrix structure. These structures primarily relate to the learning objectives. However, there are many other structures. The two additional structures I like to talk about are the military structure and the law enforcement structure, because it clearly illustrates the organizational hierarchy. For example, in the military, you have a five-star general, specifically the Army. You have a five-star general, a four-star general, three-star general, two-star general, and a one-star general. Then you also have captains, you have lieutenants, you have sergeants, you have corporals, you have infantrymen, you have majors. So as you can see in the organizational structure, the hierarchical structure, we tend to look at the structures from top to bottom. But looking at the structure from bottom to top, you will see at the very end of the structure is essentially the employee or the infantryman. At the very top of the structure is a five-star general or the general of the Army. It is like that in organizations, in private organizations. In law enforcement structures, in law enforcement organizations, their structures are pretty much reminiscent of military structures. You do have a chief, you have an assistant chief, a deputy, assistant deputy, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, and it varies depending on the organization. So again, looking at organizational structures exist in all forms, in all types of organizations. It is incumbent upon us as leaders to make sure that employees do know who they report to, that chain of command. But it is also incumbent upon us as leaders that once we have our supervisors, our managers, who are ultimately responsible for our employees, that we do not overburden them by giving them too many employees, thus the span of control. So now let's look at titles. Leadership has nothing to do with titles. It's not about titles. Leadership is truly not about titles. Leadership is not a rank. Leadership is not a title. In some organizations, there are ranks. There are titles such as CFO, CEO, COO. So again, there are titles within the organization, such as supervisor. You may be a team leader. Those are actual titles, but they are not indicative of leadership. Leadership has nothing to do with titles. Leadership has everything to do with how the leader gets everyone on board to fulfill the organizational mission. So a title doesn't equate to leadership. Leadership is comprised of a dynamic mix of behaviors, mindset, and skills which are used to move people where a leader wants them to be for the betterment of the organization or the attainment of the organizational mission. So leadership truly is about action. Leadership has nothing to do with titles. Leadership is also about synergy. So, and actually, it is the core attribute of leaders. Leaders must be able to bring synergy to the team, and the team will bring success to itself. How do we do that? We do that by making sure that we elicit buy-in, once again, from followers. We don't use our rank. We don't use our title. We use our leadership characteristics, our strengths, our abilities to elicit buy-in from followers. Why is this important when we talk about organizational structure? Well, in the illustration previously, we talked about the structure. We talked about who's at the top of the structure or the hierarchy and who is considered to be at the very bottom of the hierarchy, which are employees or followers. So we have to understand what it entails to be a follower. Well, essentially, a follower is someone who can take on the role as leader when the need arises. And there are some characteristics that we must understand when it comes to followership, such as they're highly participative, they're critical thinkers, They engage in self-management. They're highly committed. They have competency for the job. They're highly competent. They're focused. They have courage. They have credibility, honesty. So in looking at the leader-follower alignment, the nature of leader-follower relationships involves reciprocity, which is the mutual exchange of influence. Leadership and followership are closely intertwined, like leadership and management, but they're different. Both leader and follower roles are proactive, and together they achieve a shared vision. So there are several leader and follower characteristics and attributes. However, one of the core attributes of a leader, once again, is to simply bring synergy to the team. So the nature of the leader-follower relationship involves reciprocity. And so together they can achieve a shared vision. So once the leader-follower alignment is strengthened, the organization can actually thrive. It can be successful. So again, when we look at leadership, organizational behavior, organizational structure, in that structure itself, we must look at titles. We must understand what titles mean. In that same realm, we must understand what leadership entails, which has nothing to do with titles. Again, there are many organizations that have various titles. I should say members with various titles. Once again, like such as team leader, supervisor, etc. I recall in one organization I performed a study on, some of the leaders couldn't understand why the atmosphere was toxic or negative. After conducting a survey with the employees, with over 500 employees, they said, well, it's the leadership. They felt that the leader in that organization wasn't in fact a leader, even though that leader called himself a leader, recognized himself as a leader, said that he is a leader simply because of his rank. His rank was indicative of being at the very top of the echelon for his department or unit. So he was in charge of a department. He did have a span of control, he did have a title, and he had authority. That made him, in his mind, believe that he was extremely powerful. Powerful in such that he can speak to anyone in any manner in which he chose. He also mentioned that he is a leader because his title suggests that he is in fact a leader. Understanding that, once again, leadership is not indicative of one's title. It is truly indicative on the knowledge, the skills, the attributes that one brings to the table, the characteristics, the traits, understanding a greater self of oneself, as well as others, how to elicit buy-in from followers as well. That truly can elevate or increase someone's leadership acumen. But it is essentially the followers who determine who leaders are. And the followers have the option of truly following leaders. What do I mean by this? It's very simple. You have a lot of employees in organizations that if they feel they're not a good organizational fit, usually because there's a mismatch between the leader or supposed leader and the employee. So the employee wants to be happy on the job and decides to leave until they feel they can secure employment in an organization where they feel that it is indeed an organizational fit. It's a good win-win for not only the organization, but the employee. So looking at titles again, we must look at organizational structure. Looking at organizational structure, then we have to look at followership within that matrix. Also understanding that titles have nothing to do with leadership. and understand why we continue to discuss leadership when we talk about organizational behavior, because of the characters that make up the organization, such as the manager, a leader, and employees. Armed with this information, organizations stand to be in a better position to be effective.